The dust kicked up from Jake Morrison's old pickup truck as he drove along the remote highway that cut through the vast Montana wilderness. It was a scorching July afternoon, and the sun blazed down mercilessly on the endless stretches of prairie land. Jake had been driving for nearly 2 hours, returning from the livestock auction in Billings where he'd managed to sell a small herd of cattle. The money wasn't much, but it would help keep his struggling ranch afloat for another month. Jake was a third-generation rancher who had inherited the Morrison Ranch from his father 15 years ago. The 2,000-acre property had been in the family since 1952, when his grandfather first settled in this remote corner of Montana. Life hadn't been easy for Jake. The ranch barely made enough money to cover expenses, and he often worked 16-hour days just to keep everything running. His wife Sarah had left him 3 years earlier, unable to handle the isolation and financial stress that came with ranch life. Since then, it had been just Jake, his loyal border collie Rex, and the cattle that depended on him for survival. As Jake drove along Highway 212, he noticed something unusual ahead. There, on the side of the road about half a mile away, was what appeared to be a broken-down vehicle. As he got closer, he could see it was an old sedan with steam rising from under the hood. A woman stood beside the car, waving frantically at approaching vehicles. Several cars and trucks had already passed her by without stopping, their drivers probably too concerned about their own schedules to help a stranger. Jake slowed his pickup and pulled over behind the disabled vehicle. He could see now that the woman was Native American, probably in her mid-30s with long black hair and wearing a simple blue dress. She looked exhausted and worried, and there was something about her expression that reminded Jake of his own struggles. He had always believed in helping others when he could, a value his father had instilled in him from childhood. As Jake stepped out of his truck, the woman approached him with relief evident on her face. "Thank you so much for stopping," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent that Jake recognized as typical of the local tribal communities. "My car broke down about an hour ago, and nobody else would stop to help." Jake introduced himself and learned that the woman's name was Maria Crowfeather. She explained that she lived on the Little Bighorn Reservation, about 30 miles away, and had been driving to Billings to pick up medicine for her elderly mother who was seriously ill. The medication was crucial, and Maria had been desperate to get it back to the reservation before evening. Jake examined Maria's car and quickly determined that the radiator had overheated and likely had a significant leak. The engine was too hot to work on safely, and even if he could fix it temporarily, the car wouldn't make it 30 miles back to the reservation. Maria looked devastated when Jake explained the situation. She had used her last bit of savings to buy the medicine, and now she had no way to get home. Without hesitation, Jake offered to drive Maria back to the reservation. He told her they could come back for her car later, once it had cooled down and he could arrange for a tow truck. Maria was initially reluctant to accept help from a stranger, but Jake assured her that he understood what it was like to face difficult situations alone. He mentioned that his own ranch was struggling and he knew how important it was for people to help each other during tough times. During the 40-minute drive to the reservation, Jake and Maria talked about their lives. Maria explained that she was a single mother raising 2 young children, ages 8 and 12, while also caring for her sick mother. She worked part-time as a teacher's aide at the reservation school, but the job barely provided enough income to support her family. Her mother had diabetes and heart problems, and the medical expenses were overwhelming. Jake shared his own struggles with keeping the ranch profitable and mentioned how lonely life had become since his wife left. He talked about the challenges of maintaining such a large property with limited resources and how he sometimes wondered if he should just sell the land and move to the city. But he also spoke about his deep connection to the land and his desire to honor his family's legacy. When they arrived at Maria's small house on the reservation, Jake was struck by how modest and simple it was, yet he could see that Maria took great pride in maintaining it. Her 2 children, Tommy and Lisa, ran out to greet their mother, clearly relieved to see her return safely. Maria introduced Jake to her family and explained how he had helped her when her car broke down. Maria's mother, an elderly woman named Grace Crowfeather, thanked Jake profusely for his kindness. Despite being obviously ill, Grace had a dignity and warmth that impressed Jake immediately. She invited him to stay for dinner, but Jake politely declined, saying he needed to get back to his ranch to take care of his cattle. Before leaving, Jake gave Maria his phone number and told her to call if she needed help getting her car repaired or if there was anything else he could do. Maria was touched by his generosity and thanked him repeatedly. She mentioned that her tribe valued kindness and that Jake's actions would not be forgotten. As Jake drove back to his ranch that evening, he reflected on the day's events. Helping Maria had felt like the right thing to do, and it had actually lifted his spirits in a way he hadn't experienced in months. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he had made a real difference in someone's life. Jake didn't expect anything in return for his help. He had grown up believing that you help others simply because it's the right thing to do, not because you expect to be rewarded. His father had always said that kindness was its own reward, and Jake had lived by that principle his entire life. That night, as Jake sat on his porch with Rex at his feet, he felt a sense of satisfaction that had been missing from his life for too long. He had no idea that his simple act of kindness was about to change his life in ways he could never have imagined. The next morning would bring visitors to his ranch, and with them, a gesture of gratitude that would restore his faith in the goodness of people and provide him with the help he desperately needed to save his family's legacy. Jake woke up at dawn the next morning, as he had every day for the past 15 years. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting long shadows across his property. He pulled on his worn boots and headed outside to begin his daily routine of checking on the cattle and ensuring that all the fences were secure. Rex bounded alongside him, tail wagging with the enthusiasm that only a working dog could maintain. As Jake walked through his pastures, he couldn't shake the memory of yesterday's encounter with Maria Crowfeather. There had been something special about meeting her and her family, something that had reminded him why he loved living in Montana despite all the hardships. The vast open spaces, the sense of community among neighbors, and the understanding that people looked out for each other. These were the things that made ranch life meaningful. However, the reality of his financial situation quickly brought Jake back to earth. The money from yesterday's cattle sale would barely cover his mortgage payment, and he still owed significant amounts to the feed store, the veterinarian, and the equipment repair shop. His aging tractor needed major repairs, and several sections of fencing around his property were in desperate need of replacement. Jake had been putting off these expenses for months, hoping that things would somehow improve. But deep down, he knew he was fighting a losing battle. Around 9 o'clock in the morning, as Jake was fixing a water trough near the main gate, he noticed a cloud of dust approaching from the direction of the highway. At first, he assumed it was just someone who had taken a wrong turn and would soon head back toward the main road. But as the vehicles got closer, Jake realized there were multiple trucks and cars all heading directly toward his property. Rex began barking excitedly as the convoy of vehicles pulled into Jake's driveway. Jake counted at least 8 pickup trucks, 2 SUVs, and several cars all filled with people. As the vehicles parked near his house, Jake saw dozens of Native American men, women, and children climbing out. Many of them were carrying tools, supplies, and equipment that Jake couldn't immediately identify. Among the group, Jake spotted Maria Crowfeather walking toward him with a warm smile on her face. She was accompanied by an elderly man who carried himself with obvious authority and dignity. Jake could tell immediately that this man was someone important within the tribal community. Maria approached Jake with genuine warmth and introduced the elderly man as Robert Standing Bear, the tribal council chairman and one of the most respected elders on the Little Bighorn Reservation. Chairman Standing Bear extended his hand to Jake with a firm grip and looked him directly in the eyes as he spoke. "Mr. Morrison," the chairman began, his voice carrying the weight of years of wisdom and experience, "Maria has told us about your kindness yesterday. She explained how you stopped to help her when no one else would and how you drove her all the way home without asking for anything in return. In our culture, such acts of generosity create bonds that cannot be broken." Jake felt somewhat overwhelmed by the chairman's words and the presence of so many people on his property. He tried to explain that he had simply done what anyone should do in such a situation. But Chairman Standing Bear raised his hand gently to indicate that Jake should listen. "Among our people," the chairman continued, We have a saying that kindness creates circles that grow ever wider. When someone shows genuine compassion to one of our tribal members, they become part of our extended family. Maria told us about your struggles with your ranch, and we have come here today to show you the same kindness that you showed to her. As Chairman Standing Bear spoke, Jake noticed that the tribal members who had accompanied him were already beginning to unload tools, building materials and supplies from their vehicles. There were carpenters, electricians, mechanics, and general laborers, all preparing to work on various projects around Jake's property. Maria stepped forward and explained what the group had planned. Over the past evening and early morning, word had spread throughout the reservation about Jake's act of kindness. The tribal council had met in emergency session and decided to organize a community effort to help Jake with the most pressing repairs and improvements needed on his ranch. The tribal members had donated materials, volunteered their time and expertise, and even collected money to purchase additional supplies. Local businesses on the reservation had contributed tools and equipment, and several tribal members who worked in construction and farming had taken time off from their regular jobs to participate in this effort. Jake was speechless as Maria explained the scope of what they planned to accomplish. The group included experienced fence builders who would repair and replace the damaged sections around his property. There were mechanics who would work on his aging tractor and other farm equipment. Carpenters planned to fix the roof on his barn and repair the front porch of his house, which had been sagging for over a year. Additionally, several tribal members who were experienced in cattle ranching offered to share their knowledge about improving pasture management and implementing more efficient feeding strategies that could help Jake reduce his operating costs. They brought with them traditional techniques that had been passed down through generations, methods that could help Jake's land become more productive with less expense. Chairman Standing Bear explained that this type of community response was deeply rooted in Native American culture. He talked about the concept of giving circles, where acts of generosity create ongoing cycles of mutual support and assistance. He emphasized that this wasn't charity, but rather the formation of lasting relationships based on respect and reciprocity. As Jake tried to process what was happening, he felt emotions that he hadn't experienced in years. The overwhelming sense of gratitude was mixed with amazement at the generosity of people who barely knew him. He had grown up hearing stories about the strong sense of community among Native American tribes, but witnessing it firsthand was entirely different from just hearing about it. Maria's children, Tommy and Lisa, had come with the group and were already exploring Jake's property with the excitement that only children could maintain. They were particularly fascinated by Rex, who seemed to enjoy the attention and was showing off his best tricks for his new audience. The organization and efficiency of the tribal group impressed Jake immensely. Within an hour of their arrival, different teams had spread out across his property and were working on multiple projects simultaneously. The sound of hammers, power tools, and friendly conversation filled the air as Jake's ranch came alive with activity that it hadn't seen in years. Jake realized that this was just the beginning of what would turn out to be an extraordinary day, one that would fundamentally change his perspective on community, friendship, and the power of simple human kindness. By mid-morning, Jake's ranch had transformed into a bustling hub of activity unlike anything he had ever witnessed. The tribal members worked with a coordination and efficiency that amazed him, as if they had been planning this operation for weeks, rather than organizing it overnight. Jake found himself moving from group to group, watching in wonder as years of accumulated problems were systematically addressed by skilled craftsmen who seemed to take genuine pleasure in their work. Near the main barn, a team of 5 men led by a master carpenter named Joseph Two Eagles was completely rebuilding the roof structure that had been leaking for over 2 years. Jake had obtained several estimates for this repair, all of which were far beyond his financial means. Joseph explained that he had learned traditional building techniques from his grandfather, combined with modern construction methods, creating structures that were both durable and efficient. The men worked with a rhythm that spoke of years of collaboration. They sang traditional work songs in their native language while they hammered and sawed, creating an atmosphere that felt almost ceremonial. Joseph told Jake that in their culture, working together to help a community member was considered a sacred act, one that strengthened the bonds between all participants. Meanwhile, near the equipment shed, a team of mechanics led by Maria's cousin, David Crow Feather, had completely disassembled Jake's temperamental tractor. The machine had been giving Jake trouble for over a year, frequently breaking down at the worst possible moments and costing him hundreds of dollars in repair bills that he could barely afford. David explained that he had worked as a heavy equipment mechanic for the State Highway Department for 15 years before returning to the reservation to start his own repair business. As he and his team worked on the tractor, David pointed out several problems that previous mechanics had either missed or ignored. He showed Jake how certain maintenance procedures, if performed regularly, could extend the life of the equipment significantly and prevent costly breakdowns. The most impressive project was taking place along the perimeter of Jake's property, where a crew of 12 men and women were systematically replacing damaged fence posts and repairing miles of wire fencing. The team leader, an elderly man named Samuel Blackhorse, had spent 40 years working on ranches throughout Montana and Wyoming before retiring to the reservation. Samuel explained to Jake that proper fencing was crucial for any successful ranching operation, not just for keeping cattle contained, but for managing grazing patterns that could improve the health of the grassland. He showed Jake techniques for setting posts that would last decades rather than years, and demonstrated how to tension wire in ways that could withstand Montana's harsh winter weather. As Jake watched the fencing crew work, he was struck by the mixture of ages represented in the group. There were teenagers working alongside men in their 60s, with the older workers patiently teaching traditional techniques to the younger generation. Samuel explained that this was how knowledge was preserved in their community, through hands-on experience shared between generations. Around noon, Jake noticed that several tribal women had arrived and were setting up what appeared to be an outdoor kitchen near his house. Led by Maria's aunt, Eleanor Crow Feather, the women had brought folding tables, portable cooking equipment, and enough food to feed a small army. Eleanor explained that no proper workday could happen without ensuring that everyone was well fed. The meal that Eleanor and her team prepared was unlike anything Jake had ever experienced. There were traditional fry breads, elk stew, wild rice, dishes, and various vegetables that Jake had never tasted before. Eleanor explained the cultural significance of many of the foods, describing how certain dishes were prepared for specific occasions and how recipes had been passed down through families for generations. As everyone gathered to eat, Jake found himself sitting in a large circle with tribal members of all ages. The conversation flowed easily between English and the native language, with frequent translations for Jake's benefit. He learned about tribal history, traditional farming techniques, and contemporary challenges facing the reservation community. Chairman Standing Bear used the meal as an opportunity to explain more about the philosophy behind their community response. He talked about the concept of the seventh-generation principle, which required considering the impact of current actions on 7 generations into the future. He explained that helping Jake maintain his ranch was not just about repaying a tanserdia kindness, but about preserving agricultural land that would benefit the entire region for generations to come. During the meal, Jake also learned more about the individual tribal members who had come to help him. There was Margaret Prettyhorse, a teacher, who had taken a vacation day to help with the project. James Running Bear was a veteran who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and now worked as a counselor for other veterans on the reservation. Sarah Little Wolf was a single mother who worked 2 jobs, but had still found time to contribute her carpentry skills to the barn repair project. Each person Jake met had their own story of struggle and perseverance, yet they had all chosen to spend their day helping someone they barely knew. Jake began to understand that this wasn't unusual behavior within their community, but rather a reflection of values that prioritized collective well-being over individual concerns. After the meal, the work resumed with even greater energy. Jake noticed that the tribal members weren't just fixing immediate problems, but were implementing improvements that would make his ranch more efficient and profitable in the long term. They were upgrading his water distribution system, improving drainage around the barn, and installing more efficient gates and handling facilities for his cattle. As the afternoon wore on, Jake found himself working alongside the tribal members, rather than just observing. They welcomed his participation and patiently taught him techniques that he had never learned despite 15 years of ranching. He realized that his formal education in agriculture had somehow missed many practical skills that these men and women had learned through generations of hands-on experience. The most meaningful moment of the day came when Jake was working on the fence line with Samuel Blackhorse and several younger tribal members. Samuel began telling stories about the land they were working on, describing how his grandfather had hunted in this area over a century ago. He talked about the seasonal patterns of wildlife, the traditional uses of native plants, and the spiritual significance that his people attached to caring for the land. Jake realized that he was learning not just practical ranching techniques, but a completely different way of thinking about his relationship with the land. The tribal members didn't see themselves as owners of the land, but rather as temporary caretakers responsible for ensuring its health for future generations. This perspective gave Jake a new appreciation for his role as a rancher and a deeper understanding of the responsibility that came with managing such a large piece of Montana's landscape. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, the transformation of Jake's ranch became even more apparent. What had been a collection of aging, deteriorating structures that morning now looked like a well-maintained, efficient operation. The new roof on the barn gleamed in the afternoon sunlight. The repaired fencing stretched straight and strong across the pastures, and the sound of Jake's tractor running smoothly for the first time in months filled the air with a satisfying, mechanical purr. Jake walked through his property with Chairman Standing Bear, Maria, and several other tribal elders, surveying the day's accomplishments. The chairman pointed out various improvements and explained how each one would contribute to the ranch's long-term success. The upgraded water system would reduce Jake's labor costs and improve the health of his cattle. The improved fencing would last for decades with minimal maintenance. The barn repairs would protect his hay and equipment from Montana's harsh weather. But the most significant change wasn't visible in the physical improvements. Jake realized that his entire perspective on ranching, community, and life in rural Montana had been fundamentally altered by this experience. For years he had struggled alone, believing that accepting help was somehow a sign of weakness or failure. The tribal community had shown him that collaboration and mutual support were actually signs of strength and wisdom. Maria approached Jake as he stood looking out over his newly repaired pastures. She thanked him again for his help the previous day, but Jake found himself struggling to find words to express his gratitude for what the tribal community had done for him. Maria smiled and told him that thanks weren't necessary among family, and that's what he had become through his act of kindness. As the work crews began cleaning up their tools and preparing to leave, several tribal members approached Jake with offers of ongoing assistance. David Crowfeather left his business card and told Jake to call him anytime he needed mechanical work, promising fair prices and reliable service. Joseph Two Eagles offered to help with any future construction projects, and Samuel Blackhorse invited Jake to join a regional ranchers association that included both native and non-native farmers and ranchers. The most surprising offer came from a quiet woman named Dr. Patricia Spotted Elk, who had worked alongside the other volunteers all day. Without Jake realizing she was a veterinarian, she explained that she provided mobile veterinary services to ranchers throughout the region and offered to help Jake develop a preventive healthcare program for his cattle that could save him thousands of dollars annually in medical costs. Eleanor Crowfeather, who had coordinated the meal preparation, packed several containers of leftover food for Jake to take to his house. She also gave him recipes for some of the traditional dishes he had enjoyed, along with information about where he could purchase the special ingredients on the reservation. She mentioned that the tribal community operated a farmer's market every Saturday, and Jake would always be welcome to participate either as a customer or as a vendor if he wanted to sell some of his own produce. As the vehicles began loading up, with tools and equipment, Jake noticed that Maria's children, Tommy and Lisa, seemed reluctant to leave. They had spent much of the day playing with Rex and exploring the ranch, and they were clearly fascinated by ranch life. Maria mentioned that both children had shown interest in agriculture and animal husbandry, but there were limited opportunities on the reservation for them to gain hands-on experience with large-scale farming operations. Jake immediately offered to have the children visit his ranch regularly, where they could learn about cattle ranching and help with various chores. He explained that he could use the help, and it would give him an opportunity to share his knowledge with the next generation. Maria was touched by the offer and accepted on behalf of her children, who were obviously excited about the prospect of spending more time on the ranch. Chairman Standing Bear gathered everyone together for a closing ceremony before they departed. The group formed a large circle that included Jake, and the chairman offered a prayer in both English and the native language. He thanked the Creator for bringing them together, asked for blessings on Jake's ranch and family, and expressed gratitude for the opportunity to demonstrate the values of their community through actions rather than just words. The chairman then presented Jake with a handmade leather belt that featured traditional beadwork and silver conchos. He explained that the belt had been crafted by one of the reservation's master leather workers, and that the designs represented protection, prosperity, and the bonds of friendship. Jake was deeply moved by the gift and promised to wear it with pride and respect. As the tribal members prepared to leave, many of them exchanged contact information with Jake and invited him to visit the reservation for various community events and celebrations. Jake learned about powwows, rodeos, cultural festivals, and other gatherings where he would be welcomed as a friend and honorary member of their extended community. The last vehicle to leave was Chairman Standing Bear's pickup truck. Before departing, the chairman had a private conversation with Jake about the deeper significance of what had happened that day. He explained that Jake's simple act of kindness had created ripple effects throughout the tribal community, inspiring discussions about cooperation with neighboring ranchers and the importance of building bridges between different cultural communities. The dear chairman also shared some wisdom about the challenges that Jake would continue to face as a rancher in Montana. He acknowledged that the physical improvements made to the ranch would help with immediate problems, but he emphasized that long-term success would depend on Jake's willingness to maintain the relationships that had been formed that day. He encouraged Jake to reach out for help when needed and to offer assistance to others when possible. As the dust settled from the departing vehicles, Jake stood alone on his porch with Rex at his side, looking out over his transformed property. The silence felt different now, not the lonely isolation he had experienced for years, but the peaceful quiet of a working ranch that was well-maintained and efficiently organized. Jake realized that this day had given him much more than just repairs and improvements to his property. It had restored his faith in the fundamental goodness of people and shown him that community support was available if he was willing to accept it. The tribal members had not just fixed his ranch, they had reminded him of the values and connections that made rural life meaningful and sustainable. That evening, as Jake prepared dinner using some of Eleanor's leftover food, he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed in just 2 days. He had gone from being a struggling, isolated rancher to being part of an extended community that valued mutual support and collective success. He understood now that he was no longer facing his challenges alone. The weeks following the tribal community's remarkable intervention brought changes to Jake's life that extended far beyond the physical improvements to his ranch. Within the first week, he noticed that his daily operations were running more smoothly than they had in years. The repaired tractor started reliably every morning. The new fencing kept his cattle properly contained, and the waterproof barn protected his hay and equipment from a series of summer thunderstorms that would have previously caused significant damage. More importantly, Jake found himself connected to a network of support that he had never experienced before. David Crow Feather called within a few days to check on the tractor repairs and ended up providing Jake with valuable advice about maintaining his other equipment. Dr. Patricia Spotted Elk arrived the following week to conduct a comprehensive health evaluation of Jake's cattle herd, identifying several minor issues that could have developed into expensive problems if left untreated. The relationship with Maria Crow Feather and her family continued to develop in ways that enriched Jake's life considerably. Maria's children, Tommy and Lisa, began visiting the ranch every Saturday morning, eager to learn about cattle ranching and help with various chores. Jake discovered that he genuinely enjoyed teaching them about animal husbandry, land management, and the practical skills needed to operate a successful ranch. Tommy, who was 12 years old, showed particular interest in the mechanical aspects of ranching. Jake taught him how to maintain the tractor, repair fence posts, and operate the various tools needed for ranch work. The boy's enthusiasm reminded Jake of his own childhood, when he had learned similar skills from his father, and grandfather, Lisa, who was 8, was fascinated by the cattle themselves and showed a natural ability to understand animal behavior. Jake taught her how to approach cattle safely, recognize signs of illness or distress, and understand the seasonal patterns of ranch life. Her gentle nature with the animals impressed Jake, and he began to think that she might have a future in veterinary medicine or animal science. The children's presence on the ranch brought a vitality and joy that Jake hadn't experienced since his own childhood. Their laughter and excitement transformed routine chores into adventures, and Jake found himself looking forward to their Saturday visits with anticipation he hadn't felt in years. Maria often accompanied her children to the ranch, and she and Jake developed a friendship based on mutual respect and shared values. Maria was impressed by Jake's patience with her children and his willingness to share his knowledge without any expectation of compensation. Jake appreciated Maria's wisdom about child rearing and her insights into community building and cooperation. During one of these visits, Maria mentioned that her mother Grace's health had improved significantly since receiving the medicine that had led to Jake and Maria's first meeting. Grace had expressed a desire to meet Jake properly and thank him in person for his kindness. Jake was honored by the invitation and arranged to visit the Crowfeather family on the reservation the following weekend. The visit to Maria's home gave Jake his first real opportunity to experience life on the reservation from an insider's perspective. Grace Crowfeather, despite her health challenges, was a remarkably strong and wise woman who had raised 6 children and helped care for dozens of grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She shared stories about the history of her family and tribe, describing how they had adapted to changing circumstances while maintaining their cultural identity and values. Grace also talked about the economic challenges facing the reservation community and how tribal members had learned to support each other through difficult times. She explained that the community's response to Jake's kindness was typical of how they approached any member of their extended family who needed help. In their worldview, Jake had become part of that family through his actions, creating relationships that would last for generations. During this visit, Jake was introduced to other members of the tribal community who had not participated in the ranch repair project, but who welcomed him warmly based on the recommendations of those who had. He met teachers, business owners, artists, and retired elders, each of whom contributed to his understanding of contemporary Native American life and culture. Jake also learned about economic opportunities that could benefit both his ranch and the tribal community. Several tribal members were interested in purchasing high-quality beef directly from local ranchers, bypassing the traditional commodity markets that often provided minimal profits to producers. Jake realized that developing direct marketing relationships could significantly improve his ranch's profitability while providing tribal families with access to locally raised, hormone-free beef. Additionally, Jake discovered that the tribal community operated several successful businesses that could provide services or products his ranch needed. There was a feed mill that produced high-quality cattle feed at competitive prices, a construction company that specialized in agricultural buildings, and a transportation company that could help with livestock hauling at rates lower than Jake had been paying to larger commercial operations. These discoveries led Jake to reconsider his entire approach to ranch management. Instead of trying to handle everything independently and purchasing all his supplies from distant vendors, he began to explore how he could integrate his operation more closely with the regional economy, particularly businesses owned by tribal members who had demonstrated their commitment to his success. The financial impact of these changes became apparent within the first month. Jake's operating costs decreased significantly due to reduced repair bills, more efficient operations, and better purchasing relationships. At the same time, his income began to increase through direct sales to tribal families and improved productivity from his healthier, better-managed cattle herd. But the most significant change in Jake's life was the end of the isolation and loneliness that had plagued him for years. He now had people to call when he needed advice, friends to invite for dinner, and a sense of belonging to a community that valued his contributions. The ranch that had once felt like a burden threatening to overwhelm him now felt like a valuable part of a larger network of interconnected relationships and mutual support. Jake also began to reciprocate the assistance he had received. When he learned that Samuel Blackhorse needed help moving cattle from summer pastures to winter grazing areas, Jake volunteered his time and equipment. When Joseph Two Eagles was building a new house for his daughter's family, Jake donated lumber and worked several weekends on the construction project. When the tribal school needed guest speakers for Career Day, Jake eagerly participated, sharing his knowledge about agriculture and ranching with young students. These experiences taught Jake that giving back to the community was not just an obligation, but a source of personal satisfaction and continued learning. Each time he helped others, he gained new skills, made additional friends, and strengthened his integration into the regional community.